right now, almost certainly there is a 10th century Viking king in your pocket.
Yeah, or maybe he's, sitting in your bag right now.
Right, or strapped to your wrist, or even playing this exact audio directly into your ears.
It's pretty wild to think about.
It really is. Because every single time your phone connects wirelessly to your headphones or your smart speaker or your car dashboard, every time you use the technology called Bluetooth, you are literally invoking the name of a Viking warlord.
A warlord from Denmark who lived, over 1,000 years ago.
Exactly, King Harald Bluetooth.
And it is genuinely one of history's greatest hidden in plain sight details, I think.
Oh, absolutely.
Because he was this incredibly ambitious ruler who managed to take a fiercely divided Denmark and basically drag it, kicking and screaming, into Christianity.
And the story of how his name ended up on our tech devices is just brilliant. I was reading up on it.
Oh, the Ericsson engineers?
Yeah. So in the late 1990s, the engineers who were creating that new wireless standard, a lot of them were working for Ericsson, the Swedish company.
Right.
And they needed a temporary placeholder name. So they're out having a few beers, reading up on Viking history, and they realize something really poetic.
Because Harald Bluetooth united the fractured factions of Denmark into one kingdom.
Exactly. And their new technology was going to unite completely different devices and communication protocols into one universal standard. So they called it Bluetooth.
But the connection actually goes even deeper than just the name, right?
It does. If you look really closely at that famous Bluetooth logo,
Yeah.
the little blue oval with the jagged white shape inside it,
The one everyone taps on their screen every single day.
that exact one. It's not just some random piece of Silicon Valley tech design. It is literally a bind rune.
It's an ancient cipher.
I couldn't believe it when I found that out.
It's amazing. For those who don't know, a bind rune is basically a ligature. It's when you take two or more runes from the ancient Norse runic alphabet and overlay them,
You bind them together.
right, into one single symbol. So the engineers took Harald Bluetooth's initials, a runic H and a runic B,
And they just smashed them together.
smashed them together and digitized it.
So the Viking Age is quite literally broadcasting a radio signal from your pocket every day. And, most people have absolutely no idea.
Which makes it the perfect launch pad for our deep dive today.
Definitely. Because today, we are exploring what is arguably the most profound, earth-shattering transformation of the entire Viking Age.
We're looking at a massive internal cultural earthquake.
Yeah, something that did way more to end the Viking Age than any battlefield defeat or, peace treaty ever did. It brought it down from the inside out.
Our mission today is to explore the exact mechanisms of how the hammer gave way to the cross.
The conversion of Scandinavia.
Precisely. Now, just to set the parameters for you listening, we are not looking at the conversion of England here.
Right, because that was a very different process.
Exactly. That involved settled Norse raiders assimilating into an already established Christian society over there. And we're also not going to retell the story of Iceland's conversion today.
The peaceful one at the Althing.
Right. The uniquely democratic, peaceful path we saw in Iceland, which we spent a ton of time on back in episode 21.
Right. We're going to use Iceland as a contrast point today, but we aren't reteaching that whole story with Thorgeir under the cloak.
So instead, we are focusing squarely on the homelands. We are going to the source: Denmark, Norway, and Sweden.
The absolute belly of the beast, the exact places where the mythology of Odin and Thor actually originated.
This is the story of how the native lands of the Norsemen totally abandoned the warrior gods of their ancestors.
And it is a messy story.
Incredibly messy. It blends calculated political ambition, brutal military force, desperate geographic isolation, and this really long, deeply traumatic twilight for the old gods.
Okay, but I want to stop right there and just play devil's advocate for a second.
Sure, go for it.
Because before we look at the mechanics of how the homelands were converted, the most glaring question to me is why?
Right.
Why on earth would a Viking king willingly abandon Odin, Thor, and Tyr? I mean, these warrior kings.
They absolutely are.
They were raised in a culture that glorified death in battle. Right. The Great Hall of Valhalla, the sheer martial strength of the old gods. From our modern outside perspective, it seems completely counterintuitive to just abandon the very religion that fueled your culture's entire military expansion.
It does seem strange on the surface.
Were they having genuine spiritual awakenings, or was this like entirely a political maneuver?
Well, to understand the motivations of these kings, we have to kind of temporarily strip away our modern concept of what religion even is.
What do you mean by that?
Today, we tend to view faith as a highly personal, internal matter, right? It's about your spiritual belief. But in 10th century Scandinavia, religion was basically the fundamental operating system of social and political organization.
Ah, okay. So we're talking about the mechanics of power here,
Yeah.
not just a crisis of faith.
Think about the structural reality of Norse paganism. We touched on this in our first season when we covered the gods. It was aggressively decentralized.
Right, there was no central authority.
Exactly. There was no universal Norse church, no pagan pope sitting in some grand temple dictating dogma to everyone else. There isn't even a unified sacred text.
It was hyperlocal. Like your relationship with the gods depended entirely on what valley you lived in.
It depended completely on your local chieftain. Because there was no ordained professional priesthood, the local secular leaders essentially acted as their own priests.
So the warlord was also the religious leader.
Right. A chieftain owned the great hall where the seasonal feasts and the animal sacrifices, the blots, took place. He kept the sacred arm ring for swearing oaths. He managed the whole community's relationship with the divine.
So because the religious authority was completely decentralized, the political power stayed decentralized too.
Exactly. It perfectly supported this society of fiercely independent, wealthy warlords and free farmers who absolutely loathed the idea of answering to a central national
Oh, I see where this is going. If you are an ambitious warlord trying to elevate yourself into a true king of a unified nation, paganism is a structural nightmare for you.
It's the worst possible system.
Every chieftain beneath you is his own boss. He's running his own local franchise of the religion, complete with his own private army and his own unquestionable direct line to the gods.
And you can't fire them.
Right, because their authority is literally sacred in their own territory. They're like a bunch of independent freelancers.
That structural nightmare is exactly what kept Scandinavia fractured for centuries. But then along comes Christianity.
The ultimate corporate restructure.
It really is. If you analyze what the medieval Catholic Church offered to an aspiring autocrat, it's just the perfect administrative and ideological toolkit.
Okay, break that toolkit down for me.
Well, consider the core tenets. One absolute God, one absolute universal truth, one highly organized, strict hierarchical chain of command stretching all the way back to Rome.
Right.
But the absolute most valuable asset for these kings was the political concept of the divine right of kings.
Ah, so under paganism, a king is just, what, the guy who won the last battle and has the most silver to hand out?
Pretty much. But under Christianity, the king is officially appointed by the creator of the universe. He becomes the Lord's anointed.
That is a massive upgrade in job security.
Huge upgrade. Suddenly, to rebel against a Christian king is no longer just a standard political dispute over land borders. It elevates your rebellion to a mortal sin against God himself.
So adopting Christianity let these kings totally bypass the local chieftains.
Exactly. If the king controls the bishopric and the bishopric controls the religious life of the local villages, those stubborn chieftains are suddenly stripped of their sacred authority. They are entirely bypassed.
But it goes way beyond just theology, doesn't it? The church also brings this incredible amount of practical day-to-day administration.
It brings a literal bureaucracy. We often overlook this, but the medieval church was essentially a massive corporation of highly educated, literate men.
Right. Monks, priests, bishops.
And they all knew how to write in Latin, which was the universal programming language of European diplomacy at the time.
Which the Norse completely lacked. I mean, their laws were entirely oral. They had law speakers who literally had to stand there and memorize the entire legal code.
Imagine trying to run a sophisticated, multi-regional state based solely on oral tradition. It really limits your growth. The clergy brought the ability to draft written laws, to keep permanent land deeds, to record history, and to organize taxation on a nationwide scale.
So if you're a Viking king trying to transition from being a glorified pirate into a recognized European monarch, you desperately need that administrative machinery.
You need clerks with parchment just as much as you need berserkers with axes.
I love that. And, I was looking at the geopolitical map of the 10th century, and it seems to me that joining this Christian club wasn't just about internal control. It was about external survival.
Geopolitics played a massive role, yes. The world outside Scandinavia was changing rapidly.
Because by the 900s, almost all of Western and Central Europe was locked into this massive, interconnected religious framework.
The Frankish Empire, the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms in England, the new states in Eastern Europe, they were all Christian.
So if you are a pagan king sitting up in Denmark or Norway, You are basically locked out of the VIP room of international politics.
You're an outsider, a barbarian, a heathen. And practically speaking, that isolation carried severe economic penalties.
Like with trade, right?
Exactly. Let's look at the mechanics of trade. Christian kings were increasingly pressured by their bishops to restrict commerce with non-believers. So a pagan merchant pulling his longship into a Christian port might face heavy punitive tariffs, or he might be legally barred from the marketplace entirely.
I actually read that some Norse merchants found a loophole for that. It was called prima signatio.
Yes, prima signatio, the first signing of the cross.
Right, so they would accept this basic preliminary blessing from a priest. Not a full baptism, just a sort of spiritual visa.
A spiritual visa is a great way to put it.
And that let them access the Christian markets.
It's a perfect example of the pragmatic pressures at play. But beyond trade, there was a very real existential threat of military conquest.
Because what happens to small, fractured pagan nations sitting right on the border of a massive, expanding Christian empire?
They get swallowed up.
Specifically by the Holy Roman Empire to the south of Denmark, right?
Yes. Under leaders like Otto the Great, the German Empire was a colossal military machine. And for the German emperors, the conversion of the pagan north wasn't just some pious spiritual goal. It was a highly convenient legal justification for territorial expansion.
Because under the ideology of the era, if your neighbor is a heathen,
you possess a valid casus belli, a justification for a holy war of conquest.
So it's literally a massive target painted on your back. The German emperor can march into your lands, take your resources, and the Pope will officially bless the campaign.
Right. So for a Scandinavian king, converting to Christianity was the ultimate geopolitical shield.
It's a diplomatic maneuver.
Exactly. It's a way to say to the German emperor, hey, we worship the same God now. We are part of the brotherhood of Christ. You no longer have a moral justification to invade our borders.
It provided international security, lucrative trade routes, and unquestioned domestic legitimacy, all in one package.
It was an irresistible offer for an ambitious king.
Okay, that makes the motivation crystal clear. They wanted the centralized power, the litter administration, the trade deals, and the geopolitical shield. But, and this is but a king can't just wake up one morning, step out of his hall, and declare, "Attention everyone, we are fundamentally changing our entire worldview and abandoning our ancestral gods today."
No, absolutely not. That kind of sudden pivot would trigger an immediate revolt.
The cultural ground had to be prepared long beforehand.
And that's the thing. The kings ultimately harvested the crop, but they were certainly not the ones who plowed the fields.
To understand how the Norse mindset slowly shifted, we have to look decades, even centuries, earlier.
To the early missionaries.
Right. These were the people literally walking into the frozen north with absolutely no royal armies backing them.
Yeah.
Just a Bible, a cross, and an incomprehensible amount of courage.
It's staggering to think about. The most famous of these figures in the historical record is a 9th century Frankish monk named Ansgar.
Ansgar.
He is frequently referred to as the Apostle of the North. He ventured into Denmark and later pushed all the way into Sweden in the 820s and 830s.
Which is astounding context, because
Yeah.
that is right in the brutal thick of the early Viking Age. I mean, the raids on Lindisfarne and the European coasts are in full swing.
Oh, yeah.
The Norse are actively terrorizing the Christian world, and here is this lone monk deciding, you know what, I'm going to walk right into their trading capital.
It was an incredibly precarious mission. Ansgar did manage to build the first small wooden churches in major trading hubs like Hedeby in Denmark and Birka in Sweden. But we really have to understand the sheer psychological friction of what he was attempting.
I try to imagine the reality of his daily life. You are one man preaching about a God of peace, a God who explicitly allowed himself to be tortured and crucified without fighting back.
Right.
And you are preaching this message to an honor-based culture that fundamentally respects physical strength, martial prowess, and gods who solve their problems by smashing things with a magical hammer.
Exactly.
The concept of turning the other cheek must have sounded completely absurd to them, like downright pathetic to the average Norseman.
It absolutely ran counter to everything they valued.
Yep.
In the Norse honor system, if someone slights you or strikes you and you do not retaliate, you lose your social standing entirely.
You become a social pariah.
You do. So presenting a savior who dies passively on a cross was a massive theological hurdle. Ansgar and his successors faced constant simmering hostility. Their survival was often dependent entirely on the shifting moods of whatever local warlord happened to be in charge that year.
Right, because I imagine a pagan chieftain might allow a Christian priest to set up a small chapel in his town simply because it functioned as a lure for wealthy Christian merchants from the south.
Yeah, it's good for the local economy.
But the moment the chieftain dies, or there's a bad harvest, or a plague, who gets blamed?
The foreigner and his strange god. The churches would be burned down, the priests chased out into the forests, or simply murdered. The missions would collapse entirely, only to be restarted decades later.
So rather than viewing it as a steady building process, it seems more like an invasive plant species,
Yeah.
slowly taking root, like it gets beaten back by the frost, but the roots stay underground.
That is an excellent way to conceptualize it. Even when the physical churches were destroyed, the ideological seeds remained. Over multiple generations, these stubborn missionaries successfully introduced the idea of Christianity.
They acted like a slow-drip cultural five.
Yes, they learned the Norse language, they engaged in theological debates, and they familiarized the population with the symbols and stories of the church.
So over the span of a century, Christianity transitions in the Norse mind from, what is this bizarre, weak religion, to, oh yes, the Christians. We know them. We trade with them. Some of our cousins down in the market towns have even started wearing those little crosses.
The missionaries did the slow, dangerous, invisible work of normalizing the new faith. They mapped the cultural terrain, and that laid the crucial foundation. Because when the ambitious kings finally decided to make their political move, they weren't attempting to enforce a totally alien concept.
They were taking a quiet, existing underground movement and just weaponizing it with royal authority.
Exactly. And that causality brings us directly back to the man in our pockets.
King Harald Bluetooth.
King Harald Bluetooth.
Right.
Because Harald inherits this culturally primed landscape in Denmark in the 960s, and he executes his master plan.
Right. He is the quintessential model of the converting king.
He really is. As we noted, he successfully unified the various regional factions of Denmark under his singular rule, but unification by the sword is temporary.
He needed a permanent ideological glue to hold his new nation together.
And so he decided to cement his secular unification by officially making Denmark a Christian nation.
And he didn't just send out a written decree on parchment, did he? He commissioned what historians essentially call Denmark's birth certificate.
The Jelling stones. Specifically, the larger of the two massive runestones erected at the royal complex in Jelling.
It's an incredibly impressive piece of granite.
It's towering. And on this stone, Harald carved his legacy for eternity. The runic inscription proudly claims that he, Harald, won all of Denmark and Norway for himself. And this is the critical final clause that he made the Danes Christian.
The audacity to literally carve that claim into a three-sided boulder.
It's quite a flex.
It really is.
Yeah.
But what I find most fascinating about the Jelling stone isn't even the text, it's the artwork.
Oh, the artwork is brilliant.
The visual details perfectly capture the exact mechanism of how you sell a new religion to an old culture. On one side of the stone, there is one of the very earliest depictions of Christ in Scandinavia. But it's not the standard Roman or Byzantine depiction of Jesus suffering on a wooden cross.
It is a profound example of visual syncretism.
Let's actually define syncretism for the listener really quickly, because it's going to be a major theme for the rest of this deep dive.
Right. Syncretism is the blending, merging, or assimilation of different religious beliefs, symbols, and practices into a new combined form. When cultures collide, they rarely erase each other cleanly. They bleed into one another.
And you see that bleeding perfectly on the Jelling stone, because Christ is depicted standing straight up, arms outstretched in this really dominant pose.
There is no physical cross behind him at all.
Right. Instead, he is entirely bound and entangled in these intricate twisting branches and ribbons that are characteristic of classic Norse animal-style art. He looks almost like a legendary warrior trapped in the roots of Yggdrasil, the great world tree of Norse myth.
It is a masterful piece of visual propaganda. Harald Bluetooth is deliberately utilizing the deeply familiar ancient artistic language of the Viking world to communicate the radical message of the new Christian world.
He's presenting Christ not as a passive suffering victim, but as a triumphant, powerful figure.
A cosmic conqueror who has successfully overcome the chaos of the old gods.
He literally gave them a Christ that a Viking could respect.
It was a vital mechanism for making the new faith palatable to a warrior aristocracy. He framed the Christian God as the ultimate victorious chieftain.
You know, it's impossible to talk about this era and specifically calculated figures like Harald Bluetooth, without acknowledging how heavily this dynamic has influenced modern pop culture.
Oh, absolutely.
Like if you watch the hit historical dramas like Vikings or its sequel series Vikings, Valhalla, this exact political manipulation of religion, serves as the primary engine for the drama.
While television adaptations naturally compress timelines and invent, interpersonal drama, they actually capture the underlying socio-political tension of this era remarkably well.
Yeah, Harald Bluetooth himself actually appears as a major character in the later seasons of the original Viking series.
And the showrunners depicted him precisely as the historical record suggests, as a highly calculating, pragmatic monarch who uses faith as a tool for statecraft.
And then in Vikings, Valhalla, which is set a few decades later, the narrative conflict has completely evolved. It's no longer just the pagan Vikings sailing over to raid the Christian English.
Right, the most visceral, bloody conflict is internal.
It's pagan Vikings fighting Christian Vikings. The show leans heavily into the holy war aspect within Scandinavia. The forced baptisms, the violent persecution of the old ways, the absolute tearing apart of families and alliances based entirely on which god you choose to pray to.
That internal holy war highlights a tragic reality of the period, because once kings like Harald adopted Christianity, the faith ceased to be a matter of personal spiritual choice.
It became a strict matter of state loyalty.
Exactly. In these historical narratives, you see kings weaponizing the new religion to root out their secular political rivals. If a local chieftain opposes the king's tax policies, the king doesn't merely accuse him of treason.
He accuses him of being a heathen,
A servant of demons, and an enemy of God.
It provides the king with the ultimate, unassailable moral high ground to commit atrocities against his political enemies.
Which brings us to a stark geographical contrast. Because while Denmark's conversion under Harald Bluetooth was relatively systematic, top-down, and monumental, literally carved into a boulder, the neighboring kingdom of Norway experienced a vastly different trajectory.
I really want to emphasize the geography here for you listening, because we just talked about Denmark being relatively flat, connected to the European mainland, and pretty easy to ride an army across to enforce a royal decree.
Very easy, relatively speaking.
Norway is the complete opposite. It is a jagged, fractured landscape defined by deep fjords, towering mountains, and isolated valleys.
Yeah.
You cannot just stand in a capital city and issue a law. To enforce anything in Norway, you have to physically sail up every single fjord, march into every isolated valley, and confront the local warlord face to face.
And that geography breeds fierce independence.
Right, and that geographic reality dictates the mechanism of conversion. Norway's transformation was not achieved through subtle visual syncretism on runestones.
No. It was achieved through a terrifying, bloody crusade led by two specific kings.
Let's look at the first one. King Olaf Tryggvason. Now, listeners who have been with us might remember him from episode 21. He was the Norwegian king who sat across the ocean, putting immense pressure on Iceland to convert.
Yes.
He held Icelandic nobles hostage and threatened a total trade embargo that would have starved the island.
Olaf Tryggvason was a formidable figure. He had spent his youth abroad, raiding as a Viking and serving as a mercenary, before eventually being baptized in England. And when he returned to Norway in the 990s to violently claim the throne, he brought his new, uncompromising faith with him. He pursued the Christianization of his kingdom with a zeal that bordered on absolute fanaticism.
But how did he actually enforce it, though? Given the geography we just discussed, what was his method?
The sagas, particularly those recorded by later historians like Snorri Sturluson, describe Olaf traveling methodically through the fractured regions of Norway with a heavily armed retinue.
Just going fjord by fjord.
Exactly. He would arrive at a local assembly, summon the regional chieftains, and present them with a binary choice: accept baptism into the new faith or face his immediate violent wrath.
And if they refused?
The mechanisms of his wrath were savage and highly targeted to destroy a chieftain's social standing. For those who stubbornly clung to the old gods, Olaf employed exile, the taking of high-status hostages, and crucially, the confiscation of their ancestral lands, their odal rights.
In Norse society, stripping a man of his inherited land was tantamount to erasing his entire identity.
It was devastating.
But wait, I read he went much further than just confiscating land. The sagas mention physical mutilation.
They do. He is recorded as having prominent pagan resistors blinded, maimed, or killed using deeply cruel methods involving fire and animals.
Oh, wow.
He systematically directed his men to tear down local pagan temples, drag the wooden idols of Thor out into the mud, and hack them to pieces to prove their impotence, and he outlawed the ancient seasonal sacrifices under penalty of death.
It is the absolute definition of a top-down authoritarian terror campaign. And I want to draw a stark comparison here for everyone. Think back to our discussion of Iceland in episode 21.
Right.
The Icelandic chieftains saw this exact wave of royal violence sweeping across Norway. They saw the blood in the fjords, and what did they do? They deliberately chose a different path.
They compromised.
Exactly. They met at their democratic assembly, the Althing, and they legally, peacefully voted to adopt Christianity as a compromise to avoid a civil war. Iceland represents the passive legal compromise. Norway is the terrifying alternative. Norway is what happens when a king refuses to negotiate.
Iceland relied on the mechanism of the law. Norway was subjected to the mechanism of the sword.
Right.
Olaf Tryggvason made conversion a matter of brutal royal compulsion. However, his reign was relatively short, because you cannot terrorize a nation of independent warlords without generating massive blowback.
He made far too many enemies.
He did, and he was eventually ambushed and killed at the Great Naval Battle of Svolder around the year 1000.
But the violent project didn't die with him. Because after a brief period of pagan resurgence, along comes the second King Olaf, Olaf Haraldsson.
A figure much better known to history as Saint Olaf.
And just to tie our overarching narrative universe together, we met Saint Olaf very briefly back in episode 14. He's the older half-brother of Harald Hardrada.
Yes, the giant Viking king who ultimately died at the Battle of Stamford Bridge in 1066.
Exactly. So what's Saint Olaf's deal?
Well, Olaf Haraldsson secured the Norwegian throne in 1015, and he systematically picked up exactly where his predecessor had left off. He was just as determined to unify the country under Christ, but his methods were slightly more bureaucratic, though equally ruthless.
He intertwined royal authority with religious laws so tightly that they became completely indistinguishable.
He was actively building that administrative machinery we talked about earlier.
Right.
He brought in bishops and clergy from England, actively established church infrastructure across the valleys, and pushed through sweeping national laws that criminalized all pagan practices. He didn't just smash temples, he legislated them out of existence.
But just like the first Olaf, his heavy-handed approach alienated the local power brokers.
The chieftains despised him. They deeply resented losing their traditional religious roles, but perhaps even more so, they hated losing their political autonomy to a king who was using God as a weapon of state control.
And that simmering resentment inevitably boils over into a massive rebellion. The chieftains finally look at each other and say, "We have to stop him," and they rise up.
This internal conflict culminates in the incredibly famous Battle of Stiklestad in the year 1030. King Olaf is facing a massive, overwhelming coalition of his own rebellious subjects.
A deeply motivated alliance of pagans fighting for their gods and Christian chieftains who are simply fighting against his autocratic rule.
Exactly. And in the ensuing battle, Olaf's forces are decisively crushed, and he is killed on the field.
The sword fails. The violent crusader ends up dead in the mud at the hands of the very people he was trying to convert. But here is where the narrative takes a massive, unexpected turn. This is the great paradox of Stiklestad.
By losing the battle and losing his life, Olaf actually achieves the ultimate victory for his religion.
How so?
It is one of the most remarkable psychological pivots in medieval history. Almost immediately after Olaf's death, strange rumors begin to circulate among the peasantry. People start claiming they have witnessed miraculous events at his shallow grave.
Like what kind of events?
There are reports of blind men receiving their sight, of an unearthly light shining over the burial mound.
Okay, let me challenge this for a second. Is this just the medieval church sensing a PR opportunity and fabricating these stories to turn a dead king into a useful martyr?
Well, the church hierarchy undoubtedly capitalized on it, but historians believe there was a genuine spontaneous grassroots movement at play here. The rapid spread of the cult of Olaf suggests it deeply resonated with the common people.
Okay.
Just 1 year after his death, a local bishop had his body exhumed. The claim was that his body was completely uncorrupted, hair and nails having grown. He was immediately declared a martyr and elevated to sainthood.
Saint Olaf.
Saint Olaf, he became the eternal king of Norway.
I look at the mechanics of this, and the irony is staggering. The forced conversions, the confiscation of land, the tearing down of temples, all the violence of his life just bred deep, bitter resentment. But a martyred king, a local miracle-working saint who belongs specifically to the Norwegian soil.
That narrative bypassed the angry chieftains entirely.
Yes, it captured the genuine spiritual devotion of the everyday people. The peasants couldn't love the coercing autocrat, but they fell completely in love with the holy martyr.
It perfectly illustrates a historical truth. You can force outward compliance with military might, but you can only win true internalized conversion with a narrative that touches the human heart. The sword initiated the painful process in Norway, but the saint ultimately finished it.
Wow.
Within a generation, the cult of Saint Olaf had cemented Christianity into the very bedrock of Norwegian identity, far more deeply than any of his royal decrees ever could.
Okay, so we've tracked two paths. Denmark converts via a massive royal monument and political decree. Norway converts through a terrifying mix of bloodshed, rebellion, and holy martyrdom. But there was a third major player in the Scandinavian homelands.
And they were not going quietly into this new world.
Not at all. We must turn our attention eastward to Sweden. Of the three primary Norse homelands, Sweden was by far the slowest, the messiest, and the most fiercely resistant to the new faith.
It remained the last great stronghold of the old ways.
They really dug their heels in. Why was the Swedish experience so vastly different from their neighbors?
Once again, we have to look at the mechanics of geography.
Right.
Denmark is a peninsula physically attached to the European mainland, so it was deeply exposed to the immediate political gravity of the German Empire. Norway possesses a massive, porous coastline facing the Atlantic and England, making it highly susceptible to foreign cultural exchange.
But Sweden?
Sweden, particularly its deep, heavily forested interior regions, was geographically insulated. It was shielded from the immediate geopolitical pressure of the Holy Roman Empire, and its traditional trade routes faced eastward toward Russia and the Byzantine Empire, rather than southward toward Rome.
So the geography essentially created a massive sanctuary where the old gods could retreat and make their final stand.
And that final stand has a very specific, legendary geographical center in the historical record, the Great Temple at Uppsala.
Okay, you have to paint the picture of Uppsala for us, because the historical descriptions of this place read like something straight out of a dark fantasy novel.
They really do. Our primary and almost exclusive written source for this is a Christian chronicler named Adam of Bremen, and he was writing in the 1070s.
Note the date. Everyone, this is decades after Denmark and Norway were largely Christianized.
Right. According to Adam's accounts, there was a magnificent, massive pagan temple complex still actively operating in the heart of Sweden at Uppsala. He vividly describes it as being entirely adorned with gold, a shining beacon of heathenry.
And what was inside this golden temple?
Adam tells us that the interior housed 3 massive statues representing the core triad of the Norse pantheon. In the prominent center seat was Thor, whom they revered as the god of sky, thunder, and weather.
Oh?
On one side of him sat Woden, or Odin, the god of war, wisdom, and frenzy. And on the other side was Fricko, better known to us as Freyr, the god of peace, pleasure, and fertility, depicted with a prominent phallus.
And the rituals that Adam claims happened there.
They were supposedly massive, terrifying national events. Adam claims that every 9 years, a great communal festival was held at Uppsala, and attendance was strictly mandatory for everyone living in the Swedish provinces.
Mandatory attendance for a festival doesn't sound too bad.
Well, it was a time of immense, gruesome sacrifice. He describes a sacred grove of trees located directly next to the temple. In this grove, he claims every kind of male creature was ritually sacrificed to appease the gods. Dogs, horses, and human men.
Oh, wow.
He writes that their bodies were hung from the branches of the grove, and the trees themselves were considered deeply holy because they were saturated with the blood of the sacrifices.
All right, I have to step in and push back on this heavily.
I thought you might.
Adam of Bremen is a Christian monk. He is writing a history explicitly detailing the triumphs of his own faith against the enemies of the church. And he's writing this for an audience of Christians safely down in Germany. Is it possible or even probable that Adam is fabricating or wildly exaggerating these horrific details for pure propaganda purposes? Like, look at these terrifying, bloodthirsty, demon-worshipping heathens up in the frozen north. Aren't you glad we are sending armies and money to convert them?
It is a vital historical question, and we absolutely must treat Adam of Bremen's sensational account with a high degree of skepticism.
Right.
Modern archaeology has extensively excavated the site at Old Uppsala. They have indeed found evidence of significant cultic activity, massive feasting halls, and large burial mounds. However, they have not unearthed conclusive evidence of a massive golden temple structure exactly as he describes it.
So no golden building.
No. It is highly probable that Adam embellished the lurid, bloody details, the hanging bodies, the gold to shock and appall his Christian readers.
So it's medieval sensationalism, the 11th century equivalent of fear-mongering clickbait.
Undoubtedly. However, the core truth embedded within his exaggerated account remains valid. Uppsala was undeniably a major, enduring center of political and religious power in Sweden, and it functioned as the primary stronghold of pagan resistance much longer than anywhere else in Scandinavia.
It became the ultimate symbolic battleground between the old gods and the new world.
And that resistance led to a really chaotic political situation, right? Because you end up with this fractured timeline where Sweden is basically tearing itself apart, trying to decide which reality to live in.
Yes. The mechanism of Sweden's conversion was characterized by a deeply unstable dual system. Because the pagan resistance was so entrenched at Uppsala, Sweden suffered through a long period where Christian kings and pagan kings sometimes ruled simultaneously over different regions.
Or violently deposed one another in rapid succession.
Right. I read about King Inge the Elder. He was a Christian king of Sweden in the late 11th century. And the Swedes basically told him, "You are our king, but you are required by law to travel to Uppsala and perform the traditional animal sacrifices to the gods on behalf of the nation."
Right.
And Inge refused. Because of his Christian faith, he refused to spill the blood.
And the consequence of that refusal illustrates exactly how power functioned. The Swedish assembly didn't just accept his religious subjection, they immediately deposed him and chased him into exile.
Just fired him on the spot.
Yep. They then offered the kingship to his brother-in-law, a man named Sven, on the strict, explicit condition that he would perform the sacrifices. He agreed, earned the nickname Blotswen, or Sacrifice Swaim, and ruled as a pagan king.
Wow.
But then, 3 years later, the Christian king Inge returns with an army, sets Blotswain's house on fire, kills him, and reclaims the throne.
That story perfectly encapsulates the messiness. It's not a smooth transition. It is decades of bloody tug-of-war. But eventually, the sheer demographic and geopolitical weight of Christian Europe wins out.
The Christian kings secure permanent power.
The laws are fundamentally rewritten. The great temple at Uppsala, whether it was actually made of gold or just an impressive wooden hall, is finally torn down or burned.
It's the end of an era.
But here is the most fascinating thing about human nature. You can violently change a law overnight, you can burn down a building in an afternoon, but you cannot instantly erase centuries of deep, culturally ingrained belief from the human heart.
You cannot dictate belief. And this reality leads us to the longest, quietest, and perhaps most fascinating phase of the entire conversion process.
The period of deep syncretism, the long twilight of the gods.
Precisely. We defined syncretism earlier as the blending of beliefs. When you force a population to convert through state violence or legal decree, they don't simply hit a reset button on their consciousness.
Right, they don't just forget Thor.
The old worldview and the new worldview are forced to coexist in the same mind. They overlap, they mingle, they negotiate.
Because the reality is, people are officially baptized because the king mandates it, and they dutifully attend the new wooden church on Sundays to avoid paying a fine. But when their life is actually on the line, they default to what their ancestors trusted.
We have numerous accounts, both historical and archaeological, of Norse sailors who would enthusiastically accept Christ while they were safely docked on land. But the absolute moment a violent storm hit their open longship at sea, they immediately abandoned their new prayers and started desperately screaming to Thor.
Because in their deeply specialized pantheon, Thor was the master of the storm.
He was the god who possessed the physical strength to hold back the chaotic waves. Christ was perfectly fine for the village and the marketplace, but Thor ruled the unforgiving ocean.
They're just hedging their bets. And there is no better, more tangible evidence of this bet hedging than the archaeological finds from the period. I absolutely love this detail. Explain the mechanics of what the blacksmiths were doing.
It is a brilliant piece of material history. Archaeologists excavating Viking Age trading towns have found soapstone casting molds utilized by 10th and 11th century blacksmiths to mass-produce metal jewelry.
Right.
And beautifully, a single small block of soapstone will often feature the carved mold to cast a Christian cross directly adjacent to the carved mold to cast a pagan Mjolnir, Thor's hammer.
The blacksmiths are literally playing both sides of the religious market. It is pure capitalism.
Absolutely.
A Norse customer walks into the forge and says, "Look, the king's new reeds is coming to town, so I legally have to wear a cross around my neck now.
Yeah.
But I've got a really dangerous sea voyage coming up next month, so cast me a silver hammer to wear under my tunic, just in case."
It highlights the intensely pragmatic reality of the era. People were not agonizing over theological purity. They were seeking supernatural protection from wherever they could get it.
You even see hybrid amulets from this transitional time. Right?
Yeah. Yes. Amulets that deliberately blur the visual lines. A cross that has the distinct, heavy flared base of a Thor's hammer, or a hammer inscribed with a Christian cross. The people were actively attempting to integrate the new god into their existing flexible pantheon, treating Jesus Christ as a powerful addition rather than a complete, exclusive replacement.
But eventually the institutional church clamps down. The dual molds are thrown away. The hammers slowly fade from the archaeological record. Christianity becomes the absolute, undisputed framework of daily life across Scandinavia.
And the old era truly ends.
Yet, as I was researching this, I realized that the old gods didn't actually die. We assumed they vanished into the ether, but they didn't. They just went deeply underground. They hid in plain sight.
They survived in the deep, unpoliced cultural substrata. They survived in rural folklore, in folk remedies, in superstitions, and in ancient seasonal traditions that were simply given a thin, acceptable veneer of Christianity.
But most glaringly, they survived in the very words we speak every single day.
This is one of my favorite details.
This was one of those massive aha moments for me. If you look at the English days of the week, which derive heavily from the Germanic and Norse pagan roots that predated the arrival of Christianity.
We still routinely invoke the entire pagan pantheon.
We do. Like, Tuesday is literally Tees Day, named after Tyr, the Norse god of single combat, heroic glory, and the swearing of oaths.
And Wednesday is Woden's Day. Woden being the Anglo-Saxon linguistic variation of Odin, the All-Father, the god of wisdom and frenzy.
Thursday is explicitly and undeniably Thor's Day. And Friday is Frigg's Day, or Freyja's Day, honoring the powerful goddesses of love, foresight, and fertility.
So 1,000 years after the very last pagan temple at Uppsala was torn down, the official calendar of the modern, secular, and historically Christian world still explicitly honors the Norse gods 4 days out of every 7.
The medieval church possessed the power to conquer the kingdoms, to rewrite the laws, and to claim the souls of the people, but it completely failed to conquer the days of the week.
It is an incredible legacy.
That is just incredible to think about. But if we pull back from the specific details and look at this entire massive historical transition, I want to bring our narrative back to something we discussed way back in Season 1 in Episode 5. When we explored the deepest, most foundational, and most unique theme of Norse mythology, Ragnarok.
The doom of the gods. The twilight.
Right. We established that the Norse religion was incredibly unique globally because it was a religion that explicitly told its followers, our gods are going to lose.
Yes.
They firmly believed that Odin, Thor, Tyr, and Freyr, none of them were immortal. They were all fated to fall in a final apocalyptic battle against the chaotic forces of giants and monsters.
The myth stated that the known world would be destroyed by fire and sinking into the water, and then eventually a new, cleansed green world would rise from the ashes.
And if you apply that mythological template to the historical reality of the conversion,
The myth literally came true.
it is a profound, deeply poetic observation. The conversion process we've mapped out today was their actual Ragnarok.
Exactly. The old divine order fell, the sacred temples were smashed, the great idols were dragged into the mud, the gods, functioning as a living, breathing, public system of worship, truly died.
And they fell precisely to make way for a completely new, cleansed world, the new Christian political and spiritual order.
The grand, tragic myth of their entire culture played out in actual historical reality. It just wasn't brought about by fire giants swinging flaming swords and a giant wolf swallowing the sun.
It was brought about by the political decrees of ambitious kings, the shifting tides of European trade, and the teachings of a carpenter's son from the Middle East.
For the everyday pagans who lived through that tumultuous century, who eventually accepted the new faith, there must have been a strange, deeply tragic resonance to it all. Their own deepest cultural narrative had thoroughly prepared them for the end of their gods.
Because it was fundamentally baked into their worldview that all things, even the divine powers that shape the universe, must eventually pass away.
I think we have to pause here at the end of this timeline and genuinely honor the bittersweet human element of that dislocation. Forget the kings and the bishops for a second.
Right. Put yourself in the shoes of the common person.
Imagine you are just an old, free farmer living in a deep valley in 10th century Norway. You have sacrificed to Thor your entire life, just like your father did and his father before him, stretching back into the mist of time.
Those gods are intimately tied to your specific identity, the fertility of your specific land, and your entire understanding of how the universe functions.
And then suddenly, a king's armed retinue rides into your valley. They inform you that your ancient gods are actually malicious demons. And if you do not submit to an alien foreign god and allow a man in robes to dunk you in the local river, they will confiscate the farm your ancestors cleared, and they will blind you.
The psychological trauma of that societal dislocation is immense and difficult for us to fully grasp today. It represents the violent, forced severing of an entire people from their ancestral roots.
In historical retrospect, we frequently view the conversion of Scandinavia purely as a civilizing step forward, a necessary modernization that integrated them into Europe. But for the individuals actually living through the violence and the decrees, it was experienced as a period of profound loss, an era of immense collective cultural grief.
A whole vibrant world forcibly stripped away. And yet, this brings us to the grand overarching irony of this entire deep dive, because this precise trauma, this messy, violent forced conversion, is what ultimately ended the Viking Age from the inside out.
It was the definitive mechanism of closure. By adopting Christianity, the Scandinavians actively stopped being the terrifying other. They ceased being the heathen raiders erupting from the frozen edge of the world.
They became integrated, functioning components of medieval, feudal Europe.
Exactly. The violent culture of the seafaring warlord was slowly and inexorably replaced by the culture of the European knight and the administrative Christian monarch.
But, and this is the incredible twist that I want to end on, the very process that killed the gods as a living, breathing faith is the exact reason we still possess their stories today.
Which brings our narrative back full circle to the importance of Iceland.
Exactly. If Norway and Denmark's violent, top-down, trauma-inducing conversions were the absolute only way this transition happened, the ancient myths might have been entirely stamped out by zealous kings actively trying to erase their pagan past to prove their Christian purity.
Because they would have associated the myths purely with rebellion and heathenry.
But because Iceland found a different mechanism, because they compromised peacefully at the Althing, because they managed to avoid the trauma of a violent crusade, they didn't develop a deep, fearful hatred of their pagan past.
They were able to retain a deep, scholarly, cultural affection for it.
And so a couple of centuries later, their Christian descendants, brilliant Icelandic scholars and politicians like Snorri Sturluson, could look back at the old myths not as dangerous demons to be feared, but as fascinating ancestral poetry to be preserved.
They lovingly wrote the myths down. They compiled the prose and poetic eddas.
It is the ultimate paradox. The violent conversions in the homelands functionally killed the gods, but the peaceful conversion in Iceland immortalized the myth.
Furthermore, if Scandinavia hadn't converted to Christianity, they might never have adopted the Latin alphabet and the sophisticated manuscript culture necessary to actually record these massive stories.
Because they only had runes before that.
Right, and runes were for short inscriptions, not entire epic poems. The tales would have remained entirely oral, passed down by memory, and eventually, inevitably, they would have been lost to the grinding friction of time.
The conversion killed the gods, but gave them immortality on parchment. Which it gives me chills every time I think about it. Is the perfect historical irony.
It really is.
The very transformation that ended the Viking world is the sole reason we, 1,000 years later, are able to sit here with microphones and talk in depth about Odin, Thor, Valhalla, and Ragnarok.
It is a truly remarkable historical legacy built on a foundation of profound contradictions.
And speaking of profound legacies, that brings us to the horizon. Because next time, we are finally at the end of the road.
We invite you to join us for the grand finale of our entire series. We are going to take everything we have learned over this long journey, from the very first shocking, bloody raids at Lindisfarne to the incredible discovery of America across the Atlantic, all the way to the violent, tragic twilight of the gods we discussed today.
And we are going to face the ultimate reckoning of the Viking legacy. We're going to ask the biggest questions of all. Were they heroes? Or were they monsters?
Were they mindless destroyers tearing down civilization, or were they visionary founders building new trade networks and nations?
What is it about these people, these Norsemen, that still grips our modern imagination so fiercely?
We will explore what they truly left behind, not just in the archaeological record, but in our DNA, our legal systems, our language, and our modern culture.
It's going to be a massive conclusion to our saga.
Uh-huh.
But before we get there, I want to leave you with one final provocative thought to mull over today. We have spent an entire series mapping out how the Vikings conquered foreign lands. We watched them conquer massive tracts of England, carve out kingdoms in Ireland, lay siege to France, and establish trade empires deep into Russia.
Right.
But today, looking at the conversion, we saw foreign ideas completely conquer the Vikings in their own homes, fundamentally rewriting who they were. So when you look at the grand centuries-long clash between the Norsemen and the rest of Europe, who really won?